A decorated federal intelligence officer gets pulled over on I-95. 6 minutes later, a sergeant is on the phone with Washington, D.C., hands shaking. This is a story about a man who spent 20 years protecting a country that couldn't always see him clearly. One of those black stories that never makes the official record. A real-life story about what it costs to serve in silence and what happens when silence finally runs out of room. The dark blue Chevy Tahoe moved south on Interstate 95 at 68 miles per hour. Not 65, not 70.
There is a verification number on the back of that credential. You should call it before...
We'll sort this out at the precinct.
At every merge following distance maintained at a precise. Marcus Ellison had been this way since he was 22 years old, and a staff sergeant in the United States Army had told him that a black man in America could not afford to give anyone a reason. He had never forgotten that. He had turned it into something close to religion. The interior of the Tahoe was clean and quiet. Marcus wore dark jeans and a navy polo shirt, clean-shaven short military cut, still sharp after all these years, though the Army had been a lifetime ago, or felt like it. A wedding ring on his left hand caught the last slant of evening light coming through the windshield. On the phone mount above the dashboard, a map showed 41 minutes remaining to Savannah. Low on the radio, a gospel instrumental moved through the car like something heard through a wall in a hotel you didn't know you needed. Marcus did not sing along. He rarely did anything that wasn't necessary. He had been driving for 3 hours. He was thinking about Denise, about the leftover chicken she had texted him about at noon, about the specific silence of their house after a long trip, the kind of silence that felt like something good waiting. He was thinking about nothing at all dangerous. He was simply a man going home. The blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror at 7:42 in the evening. Marcus saw them before he registered them, consciously the way the body knows certain things before the mind catches up. His jaw moved once, a single contained shift, then nothing. His right hand found the turn signal before the decision was fully formed. Muscle memory layered over years of training, layered over something older and more personal. He guided the Tahoe to the shoulder with the same precision he had used for the entire drive. Smooth and measured, no sudden braking, no overcorrection. The vehicle came to a full stop with both tires aligned to the painted edge line. He placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, not in his lap, not at 10 and 2. On top, visible the way he had learned to do it, the way the men who trained him had said, was the only way to do it because the first few seconds after a stop are when everything can go wrong, and Marcus Ellison had made a career out of not letting things go wrong. He did not reach for his license. He did not open the glove box. He did not move at all. He waited. In the side mirror, he watched Sergeant Travis Walker step out of the cruiser. Walker was broad across the shoulders, a buzz cut going silver at the temples, and he was still wearing his sunglasses even though the sun had dropped nearly to the tree line and the light was orange and flat and offered nothing that sunglasses needed to manage. He walked the way men walk when they are certain they own the ground they are crossing, one hand loose at his side, the other near his belt, not resting, near. From the passenger side of the cruiser, Officer Dylan Reed emerged and moved wide away from the standard approach line, cutting out at an angle that placed him near the rear quarter panel of the Tahoe before Walker had even reached the driver's window. Marcus clocked this without turning his head. He knew what that positioning meant. It meant this was not a routine stop in the mind of the officer who had called it in. Routine stops did not require flanking. Walker reached the window. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at Marcus the way some men look at a thing they have already decided about the examination, a formality, the conclusion pre-existing. License registration's a proof of insurance, Walker said. No greeting, no explanation of why the stop had been made. Of course, Marcus said. His voice was low, and even the kind of voice that does not change registers based on circumstances, a voice that had been trained in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong volume could end careers or worse. He moved his right hand slowly off the wheel. Of course, he said again. I'm going to reach for my wallet now. Front left pocket. Walker watched his hand. Marcus produced his Georgia driver's license and held it out through the window. Now, I need to open the glove box for the registration. Marcus said. He did not ask. He announced. There is a difference, and Marcus Ellison understood the difference precisely. Announcing was not asking for permission. Announcing was giving the officer a chance to prepare, which was both courtesy and survival strategy. Walker's eyes moved to the glove box. Something shifted in his posture, barely visible, the kind of micro-tension that Marcus had spent years learning to read in much higher-stakes rooms. Behind the car, Reed had stopped moving. His hand was resting on his belt now, rather than near it. Marcus opened the glove box slowly. Inside, beneath the vehicle registration and proof of insurance, lay a flat, black leather wallet, unremarkable, the kind of thing that could have been a checkbook or an old passport holder. He did not touch it. He took the registration and the insurance card and passed them through the window alongside the license, and he closed the glove box and he placed his hands back on the steering wheel. Walker took the documents. He looked at the license for a long time. Not the kind of looking that involves reading, the kind that involves deciding. He looked at Marcus and then back at the license and then at Marcus again, and the space between them in that moment contained something neither man named but both understood completely. "Step out of the vehicle," Walker said. No reason given, no indication of what probable cause had generated the stop in the first place. No mention of a traffic violation, no explanation. Just the instruction delivered in the tone of a man who had given this particular instruction many times and had never once been told no. Marcus opened the door. He stepped out. He stood at his full 6 feet 2 inches in the dying Georgia light, and he did not fold his arms, and he did not look away, and he did not say anything at all. He simply stood there and was exactly who he was. On the highway behind them, a minivan had slowed. Behind the minivan, a silver sedan had slowed too, its hazard lights clicking on as it drifted toward the shoulder without fully stopping. Inside the sedan, Olivia Grant sat with her phone in her hand and watched Sergeant Travis Walker walk back toward the Tahoe and watched the second officer position himself at the rear bumper and watched the man in the dark polo shirt stand at the front of his own vehicle with his hands visible and his face still. And she did not film yet because she was not yet sure she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. She noted the time on her screen. 7:42 p.m. She kept watching. Walker came back. He stood in front of Marcus with the document still in his hand, and he said they had received reports of a vehicle matching this description. A dark SUV with Georgia plates reports indicating the vehicle might be carrying illegal weapons. Marcus said nothing for 3 full seconds. The silence was not empty. It was deliberate and dense, and it lasted exactly as long as Marcus needed it to last. Then he said, "Am I being detained, Sergeant?" Walker smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has interpreted patience as weakness so many times that he has stopped questioning the interpretation. Sir Walker said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." 40 feet behind them, Olivia Grant raised her phone. Walker turned back to Marcus and said he had reasonable suspicion to conduct a search based on the report he had received, and that Marcus could make this easy, or he could make it difficult. But either way, the search was happening. Marcus looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with fear, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to men who have spent years in rooms where reading another person accurately was the difference between mission success and something much worse. He had read Walker in the first 30 seconds. He had read Reed before the younger officer finished his flanking approach. He knew exactly what kind of stop this was and exactly what kind of men these were, and he knew that the highway shoulder of I-95 in coastal Georgia at 7:43 in the evening was not the place to litigate the Fourth Amendment out loud. He said, "I don't consent to a search, but I'm not going to stop you." Walker blinked. The sentence didn't fully land for him. He heard the second half and moved on. Reed was already at the rear of the Tahoe flashlight, cutting through the back window, one hand cupped against the glass. His body cam was running. Walker's body cam was running. Both officers had activated them when they exited the cruiser, which was procedure, which was also the detail that would matter more than anything else that happened in the next 20 minutes, though neither of them was thinking about that yet. A white pickup truck had slowed on the highway and pulled partially onto the shoulder 50 yards back. A silver Honda had done the same behind it. The light was fading fast now, the orange gone to a deep bruised purple at the horizon, and the cruiser's light bar strobed blue and red across the tree line, and across the pavement, and across Marcus Ellison's face as he stood at the front of his own vehicle and waited. Olivia Grant had stepped out of her sedan. She was crouched near her front tire phone at waist height, and she was filming. She was not a citizen who happened to have a phone. She was a journalist who happened to be driving home. And those are two very different things. And the footage she was capturing was steady and wide and caught both officers in frame. A white SUV passed slowly in the right lane. Through the passenger window, a woman in her mid-40s turned her head and saw Marcus standing at the hood of the Tahoe with his hands visible and two officers moving around his vehicle. The woman's face did something complicated and private. She had seen this particular tableau before, not once but many times in different cities under different light, and she turned away before her daughter in the back seat could follow her gaze. And the SUV accelerated and disappeared into the dusk, and the woman did not say anything for a long time. Walker told Marcus to place both hands flat on the hood of the Tahoe and to stay there. Marcus placed both hands flat on the hood of the Tahoe and stayed there. Reed finished the rear seat. Nothing. He moved to the center console. Nothing. He checked under both front seats, ran the flashlight along the floor mats, opened the small storage pocket behind the driver's seat. Nothing. Reed's movements had started out purposeful and were becoming slightly less certain with each empty compartment, the way a man looks when the evidence he expected to find is declining to appear. Walker circled to the passenger side. He opened the door and leaned in and opened the glove box. He moved the registration papers aside. His flashlight found the flat black leather wallet immediately. He picked it up, turned it over once, opened it. He looked at what was inside for several seconds without speaking. The credential was not a local badge. It was not a state police ID. It was not the standard blue card of a federal agency Walker had encountered before. Not DEA, not FBI, nothing he recognized from Joint Task Force trainings or interdepartmental briefings. The insignia on the left panel was crisp and official and entirely unfamiliar to him. On the right panel was a photograph of Marcus Ellison, sharp and formal, and beneath his name, a title that had been redacted, a black bar where the job description should have been. There was a line of small text at the bottom referencing classified access authorization. There was a phone number in the lower right corner with a Washington, D.C. area code. Walker's face did not change. This was his professional gift, the thing that had made him effective for 23 years. He processed the unfamiliar without showing that it was unfamiliar. He closed the wallet. He put it in his breast pocket. He walked back around to where Marcus was standing with both hands on the hood. "What's this?" Walker said. "That's my federal identification," Marcus said. His voice was the same temperature it had been since the beginning of the stop. It had not warmed or cooled by a single degree. Federal identification for what? "I'm not able to discuss the details of my position in this setting." Walker looked at him. Then he raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting the way a man projects when he wants the people around him to hear what he is about to say when the audience is part of the point. "Sir," Walker said, "impersonating a federal officer is a felony in the state of Georgia. I want you to understand the seriousness of what you're doing here." The word impersonating moved through the evening air and reached the people watching from the shoulder and from the slowed cars on the highway, and from the crouched woman with her phone at waist height 40 feet back. It was a specific word. It carried a specific accusation. You are not who you say you are. You are pretending. You are lying. You are a criminal performing legitimacy rather than possessing it. Marcus did not move. His hands stayed flat on the hood. The metal had cooled with the evening, and it was smooth under his palms, and he looked at the Georgia pine trees beyond the guardrail, and he breathed the way he had been trained to breathe in situations that required him not to become what the situation was trying to make him. Reed came around the front of the vehicle. He had a set of handcuffs out. "This is a detainment for investigative purposes." Reed said, the legal language coming out slightly too fast, slightly too rehearsed, the way young officers recite what they have been taught when they are not fully certain of the ground they are standing on. Marcus brought his hands off the hood and put them behind his back without being told. Reed secured the cuffs. They were tight, but not punishing. Olivia Grant's phone was no longer at waist height. It was raised. She was filming openly now, recording the man in the dark polo and the clean jeans standing handcuffed beside his own vehicle in the last light of a Georgia evening. And the footage was clear, and it was steady. And it would still be clear and steady 6 days later when 4 million people watched it. Marcus said, "There is a verification number on the back of that credential. You should call it before this goes any further." Walker took the wallet out of his breast pocket. He looked at the back. There was the number. Washington, D.C. area code, as Marcus had said. Walker looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has decided that what he is looking at cannot mean what it appears to mean, because if it meant what it appeared to mean, then something in his understanding of this evening would have to shift. And Travis Walker had not built 23 years on shifting. He put the wallet back in his pocket. "We'll sort this out at the precinct," Walker said. Reed guided Marcus toward the cruiser with one hand on his arm. Not rough, not gentle, the practiced neutral grip of departmental procedure. Marcus walked without resistance. He always walked without resistance. That was not weakness. That was strategy and patience and something else too. Something older and heavier that he had been carrying since long before tonight. At the rear door of the cruiser, Marcus turned his head. Through the gathering dark, he could see Olivia Grant still standing beside her car phone, up recording. Their eyes found each other across the distance of the shoulder, and the spinning lights and the accumulated weight of everything that had just happened. Marcus nodded once. It was small, barely a movement, the kind of signal that means, "I see you, and I know what you are doing, and it matters." Then he ducked his head and got into the back of the cruiser, and the door closed behind him, and Walker got behind the wheel, and the cruiser pulled out onto I-95, heading north towards Savannah. Marcus sat with his hands cuffed behind him, and looked out the window at the highway moving past, and thought about the number on the back of the credential in Walker's breast pocket, and about how many hours it would take before someone with the sense to dial it finally did. And about Denise, who would start to worry around 9, and about the 7 words Walker had just said in front of witnesses and 2 body cameras and a journalist's phone. "We'll sort this out at the precinct." Marcus had been in rooms in 4 countries where the outcome was genuinely uncertain. This was not one of those rooms. This was already decided. Walker just didn't know it yet. The Savannah precinct at night had a particular quality of exhaustion that Marcus recognized from a dozen other institutional buildings in a dozen other cities. The fluorescent lights ran slightly too bright and slightly too cold, the kind of light that flattened everything it touched and made people look like earlier, tireder versions of themselves. The front desk was staffed by a sergeant who had seen too many nights exactly like this one. A whiteboard near the entrance tracked monthly crime statistics in red and black dry erase marker, the numbers updated by hand, the kind of analog record-keeping that persisted in underfunded departments long after the software was supposed to have replaced it. 2 officers in the far corner were doing paperwork with the mechanical focus of people who had stopped seeing the paperwork a long time ago. Marcus was brought through the main floor without being booked. There was nothing to book him on yet, which Walker understood, and which was why the language all evening had been detainment and investigation, rather than arrest and charges. They put him in interview room 2, a small square space with a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a large mirror on one wall that was not fooling anyone, and a fluorescent fixture directly overhead that buzzed at a frequency just low enough to ignore and just high enough to notice after 20 minutes. Marcus sat down. His hands were no longer cuffed. Someone had removed them in the hallway without ceremony or explanation. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for a phone call. He did not ask for anything. He sat and he looked at the wall and he waited, because waiting was something he understood at a level that most people in this building would not have access to. And because he knew that the situation he was in was already resolving itself in ways that had nothing to do with what he said or did in this room. Out on the main floor, Walker moved through the precinct with the ease of a man in his natural habitat. He had been coming to this building for 16 of his 23 years on the force. He knew which chair at which desk had the broken wheel. He knew which vending machine gave you an extra 30 seconds before it registered the payment. He knew everyone by name, and most of them by habit, and they knew him the same way. And when he came through the door after a stop that he believed had been a good one, people could read it in the way he carried himself. He stopped at the desk of Officer Priya Mehta and said something in a low voice, and Mehta looked up and nodded, with the expression of someone filing information away for later. He stopped at the coffee station and poured a cup, and said something to a detective named Garland, who laughed once short and confirming. Then he came to the front desk sergeant, a thick-necked man named DeLuca, who had been at that desk for 11 years, and had developed the particular patience of someone who processed other people's certainties for a living. Walker set the black leather credential wallet on the counter between them. "Guy on I-95, Walker said, had this in his glove box, playing the classified game, claiming federal no-specifics whole routine. DeLuca picked up the wallet and opened it. He looked at it for longer than Walker expected. "You call the number on the back," DeLuca said. Walker took the wallet back. "We'll run it through the federal liaison in the morning. Let them sort out what agency this is supposed to be from. DeLuca looked at him. It was not a long look. It was the kind of look that contains a sentence the speaker has decided not to say out loud, and then it was over, and DeLuca turned back to his monitor, and Walker pocketed the wallet and walked toward his office, and the precinct continued its night. In interview room 2, Marcus looked at the wall. The last time he had sat in a room with this quality of light and this quality of silence, it had been in a building that did not officially exist, in a city that he was not officially in, waiting for a situation to resolve that he was not officially part of. That had been 4 years ago. The waiting had lasted 11 hours. This would not last 11 hours. He was certain of that in the way he was certain of very few things that did not involve documented intelligence. He thought about Denise. She finished her shift at 9 on Tuesdays. It was past 9 now, he knew it. Without looking at a clock, he could feel it in the particular stillness of the building around him, the way institutional spaces shifted register in the late evening. She would have checked her phone by now. She would have seen no message. She would have called once and told herself it was fine, that he sometimes went quiet on long drive days, that the coverage on A95 was inconsistent, and she knew that. Then she would have called again. He knew her the way you know someone after 17 years of a marriage that had survived deployments and classified assignments and all the particular silences that came with a life built partly in the dark. She was not a woman who panicked. She was an emergency room physician who had declared time of death on strangers and then gone back to her next patient with steady hands. But she read absence the way she read symptoms as information as signal. And 2 missed calls on a Tuesday night, when Marcus was supposed to be 40 minutes from home, was a symptom she would not be able to argue herself out of. He breathed slowly. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. A technique that had been taught to him in a government building in Virginia by a woman who said it worked equally well before a briefing and before an ambush. He had tested that claim in both contexts. It held. Training and feeling were different things, though. Training told him this was manageable and temporary, and already in the process of correcting itself. Feeling was the image of Denise sitting in the parking garage at Memorial Health, her phone in her hand, the engine off, listening to his voicemail pick up for the 3rd time. Denise pulled out of the Memorial Health parking garage at 9:22 p.m. She had taken her hospital badge off and put it in her bag and sat in the car for longer than she intended, which was not something she did on normal nights. She was a woman who moved with purpose between locations, who ate lunch standing up 3 days out of 5 because sitting down felt like a commitment she couldn't spare the time for. Sitting still in a parked car was not in her vocabulary. She called Marcus again. Voicemail. His voice on the recording was calm and brief, leave a message the way he said everything, and she listened to all 4 seconds of it before the beep. She did not leave a message. She sat for another moment, and then she started the car, and she drove toward home, and she told herself the story that wives of men like Marcus told themselves on nights like this. The story about coverage and long drives, and how he sometimes went quiet and it was always fine. It was always fine. And she told it with the discipline of someone who had told it many times before, and knew both that it was probably true and that the day it wasn't true would feel exactly like this. Lieutenant Angela Brooks arrived at the precinct at 9:35 p.m. for the start of her late administrative shift. Brooks ran internal affairs oversight for the district, which meant she worked hours that other people didn't, and knew things that other people didn't, and had developed over 2 decades a very specific instinct for the moment when a routine situation was not actually routine. She heard about the man in interview room 2 from DeLuca before she had finished signing in. Federal badge, DeLuca said, with the careful neutrality of a man who was not editorializing. Walker brought him in, off E95. Claims to be classified federal. Brooks set her bag down. What kind of badge? DeLuca described it. The insignia, the redacted title, the Washington number. Brooks was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where's the badge now?" "Walker has it." She found Walker in his office. He handed the credential wallet over without hesitation, still carrying the confidence of a man who believed the evening had confirmed his instincts. Brooks opened it. She looked at the insignia on the left panel for a long time longer than Walker had looked at it, long enough that he shifted his weight once in his chair. She had seen that symbol before. Once, 6 years ago, at a joint briefing in Atlanta, a federal local coordination meeting for a counter-narcotics task force that had overlapped briefly with something larger and much less explainable. A federal officer had run part of that briefing, and on his credentials, which he had shown only to the room's senior personnel, there had been an insignia. She had been told with the particular precision of someone who wanted the instruction to stick, that the agency behind that insignia was not a subject for follow-up questions. She closed the wallet. She handed it back to Walker. She said nothing. She went to her office and closed the door. She sat at her desk and opened her terminal and logged into a federal law enforcement database that she had retained access to through an old internal affairs clearance that had never been formally revoked. She typed in Marcus Ellison, Georgia driver's license number, date of birth. The screen returned a result in under 4 seconds. Record restricted. Contact federal security officer for access. Not no record found. Not no match in system. Restricted. There was a record. It was simply not available to her. It was not available to anyone in this building, and possibly not available to anyone in this state. And Brooks understood immediately what that meant and what it did not mean. And what it did not mean was that the man in interview room 2 was a civilian with a convincing prop. She leaned back in her chair. She picked up the credential wallet number she had written on a notepad before handing the wallet back to Walker. She looked at the Washington, D.C. area code. She did not dial it yet. In interview room 2, the door opened and a young uniformed officer came in with a paper cup of water. He was maybe 25, with the slightly uncertain posture of someone who had not yet fully inhabited the authority his uniform was supposed to convey. He set the cup on the table and was turning to go when Marcus spoke. When Sergeant Walker gets a moment, Marcus said, "Please tell him I strongly recommend he make that call tonight, not tomorrow." The officer stopped. He looked at Marcus the way people look at a thing that doesn't match the category they've placed it in. "Tonight," he repeated. "Tonight," Marcus said. "It would be better for everyone involved." The officer nodded slowly. "I'll pass that along," he said. Marcus said, "Thank you." Then he looked back at the wall, and his hands went still on the table, and he said nothing else. The officer walked out. He pulled the door shut behind him. He stood in the hallway for a moment outside the room, holding the empty tray he had brought the water in, and he could not have explained to anyone, including himself, why he felt the specific and unaccountable feeling that he had just delivered a message he did not fully understand to someone with far more patience than the situation seemed to require. He went to find Sergeant Walker. Walker was not in his office. Down the hall behind a closed door, Lieutenant Angela Brooks was still staring at the Washington, D.C. area code on her notepad, and her hand was moving slowly toward the phone. She dialed at 10:48 p.m. The line rang twice. That was all. 2 rings, and then a voice came on that was alert and clipped and carried no trace of the hour in it. The voice of someone for whom 10:48 p.m. was simply another point on a continuous operational timeline. Verification line, badge number, and your identification, please. Brooks read the badge number from her notepad. She gave her own name, rank, and badge number without being asked for the sequence. She heard keys moving on a keyboard. "Lieutenant Brooks, please hold." She held. The 90 seconds that followed were the longest 90 seconds she had experienced in 20 years of law enforcement, and she had experienced 90 seconds that contained a great deal. She sat with the phone pressed to her ear and looked at the wall of her office and did not move, and the precinct made its ordinary nighttime sounds around her, and she waited. Then a new voice came on. It was different from the first, calmer if that was possible, and carrying the particular weight of seniority, the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself, because it has long since stopped needing to. "Lieutenant Brooks, you are calling to verify the credentials of a federal officer currently detained at your facility." It was not a question. Brooks noted that. "Yes," she said. "You are holding Agent Marcus Ellison, G.S., 15 equivalent assigned to a classified national security task force under direct federal authority. His operational status is active. His security clearance level exceeds your department's access tier. I need you to confirm his current condition and location." Brooks closed her eyes for a single second. "He's in interview room 2, she said. "Unharmed, detained, not charged." "Lieutenant," the voice said, "you need to release him immediately. We will have a senior official at your precinct within the hour. Please secure his credentials and ensure they are not further examined. photographed, or discussed with anyone outside your chain of command. Understood, Brooks said. The line ended, not hung up. Ended the way federal lines ended without the ambient click of a civilian disconnect. Brooks set the phone down. She sat still for a moment in the way that people sit still when they need the room to stop moving before they can stand up in it. Then she opened her terminal again and searched the partial acronym from the badge, the one she had not fully recognized, entering it into a restricted law enforcement intelligence index that she had never needed to use at her current posting because nothing at her current posting had ever required it. The file that returned was restricted at the header level. She could not open it, but the header itself was visible a single line of classification language above a black redaction bar, and that line was enough. The task force that Marcus Ellison belonged to operated under a counterterrorism authorization framework multi-agency established in the years following September 2001. And its operational mandate covered activities that the header described only as National Security Priority Tier 1. Brooks sat with that for a moment. Marcus had not been driving home from a family visit. He had not been on vacation. His civilian clothing, the jeans and the polo, and the ordinary blue Tahoe had been intentional. He had been in a form of cover, a covert transit posture moving through a civilian corridor after a field operation that she would never have the clearance to know the details of. And Walker had seen a dark SUV on I-95 that fit a thin description he could not actually document, and he had pulled it over. And he had handcuffed an active federal intelligence officer on the shoulder of the highway in front of witnesses and body cameras and a journalist's phone. She stood up. She walked down the hall to Walker's office, and she went in, and she closed the door behind her. Walker looked up from his desk. He had the expression of a man who was still in the process of being right about something. Brooks told him what she knew. She did not tell him everything because she did not know everything, and she would not have shared all of it in Walker's office at 11 o'clock at night, even if she had. She told him the credential was verified. She told him the man in interview room 2 was an active federal agent. She told him they needed to release him now and leave the Tahoe exactly as it sat in the lot, and not discuss the details of the stop with anyone until further notice. Walker's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. The first being the reflexive dismissal of a man whose instincts have never been seriously challenged, the second being something slower and less comfortable that came when the dismissal did not fully take hold, and the third being the first genuine crack in 23 years of professional certainty. You're telling me this guy is actually Walker started? I'm telling you, we need to release him now, Brooks said, and we need to not touch anything else in that room or that vehicle. I've been doing this for 23 years, Walker said. His voice was still steady, but it was working at it now. I know when someone is running a game. I know when the story doesn't fit. Brooks looked at him for a moment. Travis, she said. Call the number yourself if you don't believe me. The office was quiet. Outside the closed door, the precinct moved through its night phones and keyboards and the distant sound of a door. Walker looked at Brooks, and Brooks looked at Walker, and neither of them said anything. And in that silence, the thing that had been holding Walker's certainty in place began very slowly to give way. At 11:55 p.m., a black SUV with federal government plates pulled into the precinct parking lot and stopped in the visitor lane nearest the entrance. Two men got out. The first was a younger man in a dark suit who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone whose job was to prepare rooms for someone else. The second was Director Nathan Cole. Cole was 58 years old, silver-haired, and built along the lines of a man who had once been physically formidable and had transitioned that into something less visible and more permanent. He wore no uniform. He carried no visible badge. He walked through the precinct entrance at a pace that was unhurried and completely unstoppable and showed his credentials to the officer at the front desk, with the minimal movement of someone who had shown credentials in more consequential places than this, and found the process equally unremarkable in all of them. The desk officer looked at what Cole put in front of him. His face went through a change that was not quite the color draining, but was adjacent to it. He reached for his phone. The night shift commander, a man named Captain Roy Aiken, had been at his desk reviewing a budget summary with the tired focus of someone doing math they already know the answer to when his phone rang. He answered. He listened for 15 seconds. Then he put the budget summary in a drawer and stood up. Cole was brought to interview room 2. The security liaison remained in the hallway. Cole went inside, and the door closed. Through the narrow reinforced window in the door, the young officer who had brought Marcus water stood at a careful distance and watched without meaning to. He could see two men at the table, one sitting who had pulled the second chair around to sit alongside, rather than across. And he could see the body language, which was not the body language of a confrontation, or an interrogation, or even a debrief in the formal sense. It was the body language of two people who knew each other, in the way that people know each other when they have operated in the same dark and serious spaces for a long time, a mutual recognition that required no performance. The conversation lasted 4 minutes, no raised voices, minimal gestures. At one point, Cole placed his hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder, and Marcus nodded once. When the door opened, Marcus walked out first. His hands were free. He buttoned the second button of his polo shirt, a small, precise movement, and he stood in the hallway at his full height, and he was entirely, completely himself. The man who had been there all along beneath the handcuffs and the fluorescent light and the hours of waiting. Cole came out behind him and turned toward the main corridor where Walker was standing. Cole looked at Walker. It was a complete and unhurried assessment, the kind of look that takes in everything it needs in the time it takes. And then Cole spoke. "Sergeant Walker," he said, "I'll need the full incident report, your body camera footage, and Officer Reed's footage on my desk by 6 a.m. All of it." Walker straightened slightly. "Sir," he said, "I was following standard procedure. The stop was based on a legitimate description, and I had reasonable grounds to believe." Cole let him finish. Then Cole said, "I know what you were following." He turned and walked back toward the front of the precinct, and Marcus walked beside him, and the hallway closed around where they had been. And Walker stood in the fluorescent light alone, with those 6 words settling into him, like something that could not be unsettled. He had been a police officer for 23 years. He had trusted his instincts in 1,000 situations, and his instincts had rewarded that trust often enough that he had stopped examining them. He had never once stood in a hallway after a stop and felt what he was feeling now, which was not quite fear and not quite shame, but was something in the neighborhood of both the specific vertigo of a man who has just been shown, without drama and without cruelty, that the ground he thought he was standing on was not as solid as he believed. He looked down the hallway. Cole and Marcus had turned the corner. They were gone. Walker stood there for a long moment. Then he went to his office and sat down and looked at the incident report form open on his desk, the one he would need to complete by 6 a.m., and he tried to find the words for what had happened on I-95 and found for the first time in 23 years that the words he had always used were no longer adequate. Olivia Grant had not slept. She had driven home from I-95 with her phone charging on the passenger seat and her mind running at a frequency that sleep could not compete with. She had reviewed the footage 3 times at her kitchen table, the screen bright in the dark room, and each time she watched it, she felt the same thing. She had felt on the highway shoulder, which was not outrage exactly, or not only outrage, but something colder and more specific. The feeling of watching a thing happen that has happened before and will keep happening until someone makes it impossible to look away from. The footage was not dramatic. That was the first thing she told her editor when she called him at 4:15 a.m., and she could hear him coming awake on the other end of the line, and she said, "I know what time it is," and he said, "Tell me what you have," and she told him. A man standing at the hood of his car with both hands flat on the metal, officers moving around the vehicle, the search, the handcuffs, the walk to the cruiser, 3 minutes and 40 seconds of a man doing nothing wrong, documented from 40 feet away with a clarity that the evening light had no business providing but had provided anyway. The station's legal team reviewed the clip by 5 a.m. At 6:30 in the morning, Olivia's editor posted it to the station's social media accounts with a single line of text. I-95 Savannah. Last night. Who is this man? By 8 a.m., the clip had 40,000 views. It was moving through the Savannah community networks, first the neighborhood Facebook groups and the local Twitter feeds, and the comments were already splitting along the fault line that American public life had long since worn into a canyon. Some said the officers had done their job, that a search was not an arrest, that people who had nothing to hide had nothing to fear, that you couldn't know from the outside what information the sergeant had been working with. Others said they knew exactly what they were looking at and had known since the first second of the footage that the man's posture said everything that you didn't stand that way unless you had learned that standing any other way was dangerous. By 10 a.m., a civil rights attorney in Atlanta with 800,000 followers on social media had reposted the clip with 3 sentences that were shared 40,000 times in the following 2 hours. By noon, the footage had landed on the desks of national news producers in New York and Washington and Los Angeles, and the calls to the Savannah Police Department's Public Affairs Office had begun. The identity of the man in the clip remained unknown. Federal privacy protocols would keep it that way longer than the news cycle wanted, but the narrative did not need a name to move. It had everything it needed in 3 minutes and 40 seconds of a man standing still. Georgia law required body camera footage to be preserved for a minimum of 90 days. Both Walker's camera and Reed's camera had been running from the moment they exited the cruiser. That footage existed, was logged, and could not be deleted, altered, or withheld without triggering a separate set of legal consequences. This was not a detail anyone at the precinct was discussing out loud on the morning of June 4th, but it was a detail that everyone with any institutional knowledge was aware of. The way people are aware of the structural condition of a building they have been told is sound but have never quite stopped thinking about. Captain Roy Aiken had been on the phone since 6 a.m. He spoke to the city attorney, first a conversation that lasted 22 minutes, and ended with the city attorney saying he would need everything in writing by end of day. He spoke to the police union representative next, a call that was carefully professional and told him very little he didn't already know. Then he spoke to a federal liaison whose name he had been given by Director Cole's security officer the night before. And that conversation was the shortest and the most clarifying of the 3 because the liaison told him in language that was courteous and precise and left no room for interpretation that the federal government's interest in the prior evening's incident was active and ongoing, that the individual who had been detained held a security clearance that exceeded the operational tier of the Savannah Police Department, and that full cooperation with any review process was expected and required. Aiken thanked him. He ended the call. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he called Walker. Walker came into Aiken's office and sat down, and the door closed. And what happened in that room was not a scene that anyone else in the precinct witnessed directly. What they saw was Walker come out 11 minutes later with the particular stillness of a man who has received news that his body has not yet finished processing. He went to his office. He came back out without his service weapon and his badge. He walked through the precinct floor without making eye contact with anyone, and went out the front door into the morning, and no one said anything because there was nothing that the situation required anyone to say. Walker believed he had been right. He had believed it on I-95, and he believed it in the precinct hallway, and he believed it still driving home in the early morning with the radio off, the fury in him, controlled and contained, but absolutely present. 23 years. He had given 23 years to an instinct he had never once doubted, and he did not doubt it now. And that was the most chilling thing about Travis Walker. The thing that would eventually matter most in the review that was coming. He was not a man who had been shaken into self-examination. He was a man who had been stopped mid-motion, and the motion had not changed, only his ability to continue it. Dylan Reed had gone quiet the moment Cole walked through the front door of the precinct. He had said almost nothing since answered questions in the minimum number of words the questions required, and by 7 a.m. he had made 2 phone calls, one to his union representative and one that no one at the precinct knew about, to a private attorney whose name he had memorized 2 years ago, at the suggestion of an older officer who told him that every cop should have a number they hoped they never needed. Reed was 29 years old, and he was scared in the specific way that young people are scared when they realize they have followed someone else's certainty to a place they cannot walk back from without cost. Lieutenant Angela Brooks spent the early morning hours doing what she did with precision and without drama. She pulled the body camera footage from both officers and reviewed it in full, taking notes on a legal pad in her handwriting that was small and exact. She noted the timestamp of the stop. She noted that Walker had not stated a legal basis for the stop at any point in the first 4 minutes of the encounter. She accessed the department's dispatch log and the incident report system and searched for any documentation of the call that Walker had referenced on the highway, the report of a dark SUV with Georgia plates carrying weapons. There was no record of that report, not in dispatch, not in the incident log, not in the shared intelligence system that served the precinct's I-95 corridor unit. She wrote that down. She drew a single line under it. She would submit the internal affairs referral by end of week. Not because anyone had asked her to, and not because of the federal attention the incident had drawn, but because the evidence on the body camera footage and in the absence of documentation described a stop that could not be legally justified by any record she could find. And that was what Internal Affairs existed to address. And Angela Brooks had spent 20 years doing exactly what the job asked of her, and she was not going to stop now. Marcus arrived home at 7:15 in the morning. Denise was awake. She had been awake since before midnight, and she had not called anyone, and she had not driven anywhere, and she had not done anything except stay in the house and wait. Because this was the particular form that her love for Marcus had taken over, 17 years of marriage to a man whose work she could not follow him into. She heard the Tahoe in the driveway. She heard the door. She was at the front entrance before he reached it. She opened the door and looked at him. He was in the same clothes. He was tired in a way that was not just the hour. She stepped aside and he came in, and as he passed her in the doorway, she put her hand against the side of his face, and he stopped walking and let her. They stood there for a moment without speaking. He did not tell her what had happened. He could not tell her all of it, and so he told her none of it, because that was the agreement they had made without ever stating it out loud. The agreement that the parts he could not share would not become the parts she spent her energy trying to reach. She had married a man who operated in classified spaces, and she had made her peace with the borders of what she was allowed to know. And that peace had cost her something real and ongoing. And she paid it every time, and she would pay it again. Was it bad this time? She said. He looked at her. I've been in worse rooms, he said. She nodded once, the nod of a woman receiving information she will carry quietly and alone. She let her hand fall from his face, and she went to the kitchen, and he heard the coffee maker begin to run, and he sat down at the kitchen table in the early morning light, and he was, for the first time since the blue and red lights had appeared in his rearview mirror, simply tired. His phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number, but he recognized the format of the identifier, the specific sequence that meant it came from a secure line inside his operational network. He opened the message. Review complete. Your discretion has been noted. Decision on your end is yours. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table. He looked at the window above the sink at the light coming in over Denise's shoulder as she stood at the counter, and he thought about I-95 and about the dark highway shoulder, and about the mother in the white SUV who had turned her face away before her daughter could see what she was seeing. He thought about every driver on that highway who had no badge in their glove box, no federal number on the back of a credential, no Washington, D.C. area code that could make a room go quiet. He thought about what the stop had looked like from 40 feet away on Olivia Grant's phone, and what it looked like from inside the back of a police cruiser, and what it had looked like probably from every other roadside in every other state where the same calculation had been made about the same kind of driver with the same quality of certainty and the same absence of documented cause. The coffee maker finished. Denise poured 2 cups. She brought them to the table and sat down across from him, and she did not ask him anything else, and he was grateful for that. And the morning light moved slowly across the kitchen floor, and Marcus Ellison sat with his hands around a warm cup and made very quietly a decision. He did not call a press line. He did not contact a news desk. He did not post anything, say anything publicly, or allow anyone to use his name in connection with the footage that was already moving through the country's attention at a speed that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what the camera had seen. What Marcus did 2 days after sitting at his kitchen table in the early morning light was call a civil rights attorney in Atlanta named Patricia Odom, whose name had been given to him by a colleague years ago, in the context of exactly this kind of situation. He called her not to file a lawsuit, which he told her in the first 60 seconds of the conversation, but to understand the landscape. He wanted to know what the data looked like before he decided what to do with his account of the evening. Odom was methodical and thorough, and she had been doing this work for 21 years. Through the internal affairs referral that Brooks had already submitted, and through the legal discovery process that the referral triggered under Georgia's law enforcement accountability statutes, a picture of Walker's stop history began to assemble itself with the impersonal clarity of numbers that do not care what anyone intended. Over the 18 months prior to the I-95 stop, Walker had conducted 340 documented traffic stops along the I-95 corridor near Savannah, 71% of those stops involved black drivers in a stretch of highway, where black drivers represented 31% of the documented traffic flow during the same period. Contraband of any kind had been found in fewer than 4% of all stops. The pattern was consistent with findings in a 2023 Department of Justice report on racial disparities in traffic enforcement, which documented that black drivers nationally were stopped at rates 50 to 60% higher than white drivers in equivalent driving conditions, with lower rates of successful searches. The numbers in Walker's record were not an outlier. They were a confirmation. Marcus read Odom's preliminary summary on a Wednesday evening. He read it without expression. Then he sat down and wrote a formal 8-page account of the events of June 3rd, precise and chronological, and he submitted it to the federal oversight body handling the incident review, and to the Savannah Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. And he did not speak to the media, and he did not put his name on anything public. And he let the record speak in the way that records speak when they are given the room to do so. By the third day after the stop, the story had changed shape. National outlets had identified through sources inside the precinct that no one was able to fully trace that the man in the I-95 footage was a decorated federal officer, that his credentials had been verified at the highest available level, and that the Savannah Police Department was under active federal and internal review as a result of his detention. His name remained protected. The agency he worked for remained unnamed, but the outline of what he was had become public, and the outline was enough. Olivia Grant was interviewed on 2 national television programs in the same week. She sat across from the anchors in a composed dark blazer, and she answered every question with the same qualities she had brought to the highway shoulder, which were precision and restraint, and the specific discipline of someone who understood that the footage spoke most clearly when she did not speak over it. She said she had been driving home. She said she had recognized something in the posture of the stop. She said she had filmed what she saw. She described only what was visible in the footage and declined to speculate beyond it. And this refusal to escalate was in its own way more powerful than anything else she could have offered. The clip reached 4.2 million views by Friday morning. It was shown in a Sunday sermon at a Baptist church in Savannah's East Side neighborhood, the pastor pausing his prepared remarks to say that what the congregation was watching was not new, that the particular stillness of the man at the hood of the car was a kind of knowledge that many of them carried in their bodies and had carried for their entire lives. And that the question the clip raised was not whether this happened, but what it would take to make it stop. It was shown by a high school civics teacher in Chatham County who asked her students to watch it without sound, first and then with sound, and then to write about the difference in what they understood each time. Walker's union issued at his statement on the 4th day. It was 4 sentences long. He had followed departmental procedure. He had acted on reasonable suspicion, consistent with his training and experience. He stood by his officers and by the work they did every day to keep the community safe. And then the 4th sentence, the one that his union representative had presumably read and approved and allowed to stand, the one that would be pulled from the statement and quoted in 7 separate national headlines before the day was out. I would make the same call again. That sentence did the work that 23 years of complaint dismissals had prevented from being done. It named without intending to the exact nature of the problem, not a mistake, not a lapse in judgment, not a bad night or a miscommunication or an unfortunate outcome of otherwise sound procedure, a certainty so complete it could not be reached by evidence, a conviction so settled it could survive being wrong. The statement's 4th sentence was screenshotted and shared and quoted and set alongside the footage with the visual simplicity of something that explains itself. I would make the same call again. And the clip of a man standing at the hood of his car with his hands flat and his face toward the tree line and everything about him exactly right. The 7 prior complaints against Walker from black drivers, all of which had been reviewed and dismissed by department supervisors over the preceding 9 years, were reopened by the Internal Affairs Division under Brooks's oversight. The complainants were contacted. 2 had moved out of state. 1 said he had stopped expecting anything to come of it. 1 said he would believe it when he saw it. All 7 were sent formal letters acknowledging that their complaints were under active review, which was a thing that none of them had received the first time. Dylan Reed had retained private counsel by the end of the first week. He was cooperating with the Internal Affairs Review fully, and without prompting from his attorney, which his attorney had noted was his own choice and not a requirement. Reed was 29 years old, and the weight of what he had participated in had settled on him in the days since Cole had walked through the precinct door in a way that the original stop had not. Perhaps because the original stop had felt like procedure, and this felt like consequence, and consequences had a texture that procedures did not. Whether the thing that was changing in him would hold whether the fork the moment had placed him at would lead somewhere different from where he had been going, no one could know yet. But the cooperation was real, and it was his. The Savannah City Council scheduled a public hearing for the third week of June. The agenda included testimony from community organizations, from legal advocates, from the department's own data analysts, and from an independent research group that had been studying I-95 corridor traffic stop patterns for 2 years and had been until this week largely without a public audience. The federal agency Marcus worked for released a single paragraph through an authorized communications channel. It confirmed that a federal officer had been improperly detained. It confirmed that appropriate oversight processes were underway. It contained no names, no agency identification, and no language that would allow a reader to determine what the task force actually did or where it operated. It was the minimum statement that the situation required, issued with the economy of an institution that valued its invisibility and was willing to spend a small amount of visibility to protect a larger amount. The third-party audit of Savannah PD traffic stop data going back 5 years was announced on a Thursday afternoon at a press conference that Captain Aiken delivered, with the deliberate stillness of a man reading from a prepared statement he had not written and would not editorialize. The audit would be conducted by an independent firm. Its findings would be made public. The timeline was 60 days. Marcus was in Washington, D.C. when the press conference happened. He watched 30 seconds of it on his phone in a corridor of a building that did not have a publicly listed address, and then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to work, because there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. And the work did not pause for press conferences or audit announcements or 4.2 million views of a man standing at the hood of his car on a Georgia highway. Denise watched the press conference at home. She watched it in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and then the coverage shifted back to the clip, the one that Olivia Grant had posted 6 days ago. And there was Marcus, her husband, in his dark polo, and his clean jeans, both hands flat on the hood of the Tahoe, his face toward the tree line, completely and terribly still. She watched it once. Then she picked up the remote and turned the television off. She sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet around her. She was proud of him, in a way that she could not have fully explained to anyone who had not built a life the way they had built theirs across all the years, and the silences and the things she was not allowed to know, and the nights like the night of June 3rd when the phone rang to voicemail, and she sat in a parking garage and told herself it was fine. She was proud and she was exhausted, and both of those things were completely true and did not cancel each other out. She picked up her phone. She typed 2 words and sent them, "home safe." The reply came in 4 seconds, which was faster than she expected and slower than she needed, and it was 1 word: always. She set the phone down on the table. She looked at the word for a moment. Then she got up and poured her cold tea down the sink and put the kettle back on, and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the window, the Savannah evening was doing what Savannah evenings did in June, going golden and slow. And Denise Ellison stood at the counter and waited for the water to boil, and let herself briefly feel the full weight of everything it meant to love a man who carried what Marcus carried, in a country that still, after everything, sometimes could not see him clearly. 6 weeks passed the way time passes after something significant, not quickly and not slowly, but with the particular weight of a period that knows it is being measured. Sergeant Travis Walker was formally suspended without pay on a Tuesday morning in mid-July, pending a disciplinary hearing scheduled for the fall. His attorney released a statement that was 4 paragraphs long and said in essence that Walker had acted in good faith and within the bounds of his training, and that the politicization of routine police work served no one's safety. Walker himself said nothing. He had gone quiet in the days after Cole's visit, and he had stayed quiet. And the silence was its own kind of answer, different from the silence of a man who has nothing to say, and closer to the silence of a man who has decided that the thing he would say is no longer welcome in the room. The likely outcome of the hearing was demotion or forced retirement. Both options had been discussed in language that was careful and institutional, and that no one involved pretended was anything other than what it was. Dylan Reed entered a departmental reform program in the second week of July and was reassigned to a mentorship rotation under a senior officer in a different unit. He was 29 years old, and the road he was on now forked in two directions, and only time would determine which way he walked it. He had cooperated fully with the Internal Affairs Review. He had not made excuses. Whether that was the beginning of something or simply the correct response to consequence, no one could say yet. And the story did not pretend otherwise. The Savannah Police Department adopted a revised traffic stop documentation protocol on July 18th, requiring officers to record specific and articulable facts, supporting reasonable suspicion, before initiating a stop facts that had to exist in the system before the lights went on, rather than being reconstructed afterward. The protocol had been drafted by a committee that included Brooks' two external legal advisors and a representative from a civil liberties organization that had been requesting exactly this kind of requirement for 4 years. It passed without a dissenting vote, which was either a sign of genuine institutional change or of institutional self-preservation, and possibly both. And the difference between those two things would be measured over the next several years, in the data, in the numbers in the stops that did and did not happen on the I-95 corridor outside Savannah. 3 of the 7 prior complaints against Walker were settled by the city before the end of July. The settlement amounts were not disclosed. What was disclosed, because Brooks had insisted on it as a condition of the process she oversaw, were the letters. Each of the 3 families received a formal letter on department letterhead, signed by the chief of police acknowledging that their complaint had been filed, that it had been dismissed without adequate review, and that the department was committed to ensuring that dismissal was corrected in the official record. It was not an apology. It was not enough. But it was the first time any of them had received any written acknowledgement that what they had reported had been real, and 2 of the 3 people who received those letters had stopped believing that would ever happen, and one of them read the letter 3 times, sitting at a kitchen table not entirely unlike Marcus's kitchen table, and sat with it for a long time. Lieutenant Angela Brooks received none of the public attention that the story generated. Her name appeared once in a local newspaper article as a department spokesperson and was not picked up by any national outlet. She did not seek coverage. She did not give interviews. She continued coming to work at the hours she had always come to work and doing the job she had always done, which was the job of making sure the institution she served was held to the standard it claimed to hold itself to, which was not glamorous work and was rarely rewarded in proportion to its difficulty. 2 weeks after the disciplinary process concluded its preliminary phase, a letter arrived at the precinct addressed to her personally. It was handwritten on plain white paper, in a hand that was precise and economical. It said, "Thank you for making the call." It was signed with a first name only, and she knew whose first name it was. She folded the letter once and put it in the bottom drawer of her desk, beneath a folder of old case notes. She did not mention it to anyone. She went back to work. Marcus drove back to Washington, D.C. on a Thursday in late July. The same dark blue Tahoe, the same route. 68 miles per hour in the right lane, turn signal used at every merge following distance maintained. The radio was low, the same gospel-adjacent instrumental that had been playing 6 weeks ago when the blue and red lights had appeared in his mirror and he had not changed the station. Not because he was making a point, but because he simply liked the music and had always liked the music and was not willing to let one evening on a Georgia highway take that from him. He passed the stretch of I-95, where the stop had occurred at 6:22 in the evening. The light was similar to what it had been that night, the sun low and orange and the shadows long across the pavement. There was no marker there, no indication that anything had happened in that spot, which was how roadsides worked and how most of American history worked, the significant moments unmarked and driven past, at highway speed by people who did not know to slow down. Marcus did not slow down. He kept his eyes on the road. He kept both hands on the wheel. He had protected his country from threats that most of the people driving this highway would never know existed. He had done it quietly in the background of the country's awareness, in the spaces between what was visible and what was safe to make visible. He would keep doing it quietly. That was the job. That had always been the job. It had cost him things he would never add up out loud, and it had given him things he would never be able to fully explain. And he had made his peace with that accounting a long time ago. What he had not made peace with, and would not make peace with, was the idea that the 7 men who had filed complaints against Walker and been dismissed had simply been unlucky, that they had stood at the hoods of their own cars on the same highway and placed their hands flat on the metal and looked at the tree line and gone home afterward to their own lives and their own kitchens and been told by the institution that their account of the evening did not rise to the level of review. He had not made peace with that, and he was not going to. He arrived in Washington, D.C. at 9:40 p.m. and went to his office, which was in a building that did not have a public-facing address, and he sat at his desk in the particular quiet of a federal building late at night, and he picked up his credential wallet from the desk, where he had set it when he came in. He looked at it for a moment, the black leather worn at the corners, the photograph inside that had been taken 7 years ago in a room he could not describe to anyone who did not already know where it was, the redacted title below his name, the insignia that Brooks had recognized and Walker had not, and that had changed everything and nothing about the evening of June 3rd, because everything about that evening had been determined before the badge was ever found. In the moment, a sergeant saw a dark SUV on a Georgia highway and made a decision he had made 340 times in 18 months. Marcus set the wallet down. He opened his laptop. He began to write a letter to the Savannah Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. It was not about his case. His case was in the hands of federal oversight and would be handled through processes that did not require his participation. The letter was about 7 other cases, 7 other complaints, 7 other nights, on 7 other stretches of road, filed by 7 men who had given their names to an institution that had thanked them and done nothing. He was requesting, formally and specifically, that each of the 7 complaints be entered into the departmental record as individual cases, each one complete and separate and deserving of the specific acknowledgement that his case had generated. Not because his case was more important, because his case had opened a door, and he was not willing to walk through it alone. He wrote for 40 minutes. He read it back once. He sent it. He closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet office for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city did at this hour, moving and lit and indifferent to the small, precise acts of conscience happening in the buildings within it. Then he picked up his phone and called Denise. She answered on the second ring. She said, "You made it." He said, "I made it." She said, "Dinner's in the refrigerator when you get home this weekend." He said, "I'll be home Friday." She said, "Good." There was a pause between them that was comfortable in the way that 17 years of pauses between 2 people can be comfortable, full of the ordinary texture of a shared life. Then she said, "I'm glad you said something about the 7 men." He had not told her the details. He never did. But she was an emergency room physician who had been married to a federal intelligence officer for 17 years, and she read the available information with the same diagnostic precision she applied to everything, and the available information had been enough. He said, "Yeah, me too." In Savannah, on the last Thursday of July, Denise finished a 12-hour shift at Memorial Health and was gathering her things at the nurse's station when a young black man was brought in through the Trauma Bay ambulatory, but shaken a minor injury to his wrist from a fall during what he described to the intake nurse as a traffic stop that escalated. He was 24 years old. He said he was fine. He said things had gotten tense and he had moved wrong, and he was fine. He just wanted to make sure his wrist wasn't broken. Denise heard this from across the station. She set her bag down. She went to him and introduced herself as Dr. Ellison and examined his wrist with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. And it was not broken, it was a sprain, and she told him this, and told him how to care for it. And she was about to leave when something made her stop. She looked at him for a moment. He was young and shaken in the specific way that young people are shaken when something has reminded them of a vulnerability they had hoped was not as large as it was. She said, "You have rights. Document everything. You matter." He looked at her. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone receiving something they needed and were not expecting. She squeezed his hand once the brief professional pressure of a doctor concluding a visit, and she walked away and collected her bag and went out through the sliding doors and across the parking lot to the garage. She made it to her car. She got in. She closed the door. And then she cried quietly and briefly in the way that people cry when the weight they have been carrying with great discipline finds a moment of release, and the parking garage was quiet around her. And she let herself feel it, the pride and the exhaustion and the love and the grief and the particular cost of being the person who waits at home, who keeps the light on, who says it was fine when it almost wasn't and means both things at once. Then she dried her face. She started the car. She drove home through the Savannah evening, through the gold light and the Spanish moss and the ordinary beauty of a city that contained, like all cities, both its worst possibilities and its best ones. And she went inside, and she put the kettle on, and she was still standing at the counter when her phone lit up with a text from Marcus that said, "Letter sent. 7 names on the record." She read it twice. She typed back one word, "Good." She meant it with everything she had. This has been one of those black stories that does not end with a parade or a headline. It ends with a man at a desk writing letters no one asked him to write for 7 men he has never met, because the door opened and he would not walk through it alone. It ends with a wife crying in a parking garage and then drying her face and driving home and putting the kettle on, because that is what strength looks like when it is not performing for anyone. It ends with a sergeant who will spend the rest of his life believing he was right, and a system that finally, slowly, and perfectly begins to say otherwise. These are the real-life stories that do not always find their way to the surface. Not because they are rare, but because the people living them are too busy doing the work, too disciplined, too careful, too determined to survive and serve and protect and love and keep going. This was one of those stories. There are thousands more. Remember his name. Remember what he carried. Remember what should have been enough from the very beginning. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling us which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories about dignity, quiet strength, and the people who carry more than they are ever given credit for, subscribe and stay with us, because there are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.